Let's move on and finish up section 5.1. We just saw three different types of frequency distributions, which are numerical ways of representing data, and now we're going to take a look at a graphical way to represent data. And this is going to focus on the grouped frequency distribution. This can be displayed as either a table, which we saw just before, or as a graph known as a histogram. A histogram is a graph of the distribution of outcomes for a single numerical variable. The height of each bar is the number of observations in the class of outcomes covered by the base of the bar, and all classes should have the same width so that bars can be compared to each other easily. Let's go ahead and look at an example of a histogram. So I'm going back to my example of the data from the student questionnaire, and I'm still looking at the variable coins. So as a reminder, in my grouped frequency distribution, I divided up into 50-cent intervals. My first interval was 0 to 49, and I had 4 individuals with values in that range. My next interval is 50 to 99, and I have 2 individuals with values in that range. For my next 2 intervals, 100 to 149 and 150 to 199, I had 0 individuals with values in those ranges. And finally, from 200 to 249, I had 1 individual within that range. Now my histogram is going to be a bar graph, and across the bottom here I've got each of my intervals labeled, and they're evenly divided, so evenly spaced out here. There's the same amount of space given for each interval from my grouped frequency distribution. And then for my vertical axis here, I've just got the range of frequencies. So my lowest frequency was 0 and my highest frequency is 4, so I want this axis to cover that entire range. And to fill it in, I'm just going to draw a bar of the correct height for each interval. So my first interval, I have a frequency of 4, so I'm going to draw a bar that goes all the way up to 4 here, and it's going to go across the whole length of the interval. I want to fill this up and not leave any gaps between my bars. So for my next interval, I've got a frequency of 2, so I'm going to find 2 and draw a bar of height 2 that covers this whole interval. Since I've got a frequency of 0 for the next 2 intervals, I'll just leave those blank. And then for my final interval, I've got a frequency of 1, so I need a bar of height 1 that fills up this entire interval here. And that's how we draw a histogram. And just to see it a little bit neater, this is how the computer draws it when I input my data, so that's just a little bit nicer to look at. Let's go ahead and see another example of making a histogram. In this example, I'm looking at a table that gives the percent of the adult population of each state of Hispanic origin, and this data comes from the 2010 census. So first question is, who are the individuals? The individuals in this chart are the states, and the variable is the percent of the adult population of Hispanic origin. So the states are my individuals, and the percents are my variables. So this is a label column here. I'm just labeling the states with their names. So before we start making our histogram, we want to note a few important things. The lowest percentile is for Maine, which has just 1.0% population of Hispanic origin. And for my high, I've got New Mexico, which has 42.3% Hispanic population. So that's my high population. So I want to keep those in mind as I go on to make my histogram. So let's look at the steps to make a histogram. First, I want to choose the classes. So this is going to divide the range of data into some reasonable number of classes of equal width. And I just noted that the range of my data is 1% in Maine to 42.3% in New Mexico. So what's a reasonable number of classes? Well, usually anywhere between 5 and 20 classes is a good number for displaying your data. And as I said, our data ranges from 1 to 42.3, so I'm going to divide it up into 5% intervals for the classes. My first class is going to be 0 to 4.9% Hispanic, and that contains my lowest value of 1.0. Then I need to include all the 5% intervals up to the one including my high percentile of 42.3. So I'm going to go in 5% increments all the way up to the interval 40.0 to 44.9% Hispanic. So if you count these up, there are actually 9 classes here. So that is a great number to have. And next we're going to make a grouped frequency distribution using those classes or intervals. Here I've already done it for you, so to fill in this chart I've just put each of my intervals here, and then for each interval I've counted up the number of states that fall into that interval. So if you count all of the states with percentages of Hispanic population between 0.0 and 4.9, that's going to give you 22 states. And then going on from 5.0 to 9.9%, I've got 15 states. From 10.0 to 14.9%, there are 4 states. From 15.0 to 19.9, there are 3 states. From 20.0 to 24.9 are 2 states. Then I've got just 1 state from 25.0 to 29.9, 2 from 30.0 to 34.9, 0 in this interval from 35.0 to 39.9. But remember, we have to include all the intervals in our grouped frequency distribution, even if there are 0 individuals that take on values in that interval. And finally, my last interval from 40.0 to 44.9 just contains my state with the highest Hispanic population, New Mexico. So let's use this grouped frequency distribution and make a histogram. So for my first interval, 0.0 to 4.9, I'm going to go up to 22, which is about here on my chart, and I want to go all the way across this interval to this tick mark here. So I'm going to make a bar that fills up that entire interval. Then 5.0 to 9.9, I go up to 15 and go across and make a bar that fills up the entire interval that goes up to 15. My next frequency is 4, so I'm going to go up to 4, which is about there, just under the line for 5. Make a bar there. Next I've got 3, so that's just a little bit lower. Then 2. And finally 1. And then I go back up to 2 for 30 to 34.9. I've got 0, so I just leave a blank space from 35 to 39.9, and then 1 from 40 to 44.9. So this is my hand-drawn histogram. So you can see there are a bunch of states with low Hispanic populations, and then as the percentage goes up, the number of states goes down, and we've got just 1 here at the end. So let's take a look. This is the histogram as it appears in your book, and it shows exactly the same data that we just looked at. So a few things to notice here. We've got 15 states that have populations between 5% and 9.9% Hispanic, so this is the same bar that I drew on that other histogram. And again, we've got the gap here and just the one state with 42.3% Hispanic population. And this chart says that may be an outlier. An outlier is a point of data that's kind of far away from all of the other data we see. So we've got this gap and just this one state over here. So we call that an outlier. So that finishes up this section. Here are some things that you should know. You should be able to identify individuals and variables in a data set. So tell me who the individuals are and what the variables are. Using a data set, you should be able to create distributions for a given variable. And we went over 3 different types of distributions. The frequency distribution, and this is where you count the number of individuals for each value. The relative frequency distribution, this is where we found percentages for each value. And then the grouped frequency distribution, where we counted the individuals in intervals of values. And finally, using that grouped frequency distribution, you should be able to create a histogram to represent data.